start projects for DESA. It's an unpaid job, by the way. And this is my wife, Shane, who will be helping me. And I understand there are some people who have been attending these presentations of mine for a period of time. I started the first time last year down at Charleston. We ran 4 sessions, and then I've been speaking at other places throughout the East. And there was one person who just came up to me. He said he was 4 times. Because whenever he comes, I usually change my routine. But I just wanted to say this, that on the presentations that I've had, usually I can shoot off into around 12 directions. I can handle programs in around 12 directions: the Battle of the Atlantic, the matter of the Pacific, relative to destroyer escorts, by the way, individual battles, and I've been working on that particular basis. In fact, for the first 2 days here, that's the way I've been working. And the programs generally have been successful and interesting. However, for the first time today, we're going to have something that is vastly different than anything that has occurred previously. Basically, it's this. I've been putting on the presentations, and the format is such that I provide a structure, and then the audience joins in, participates on the basis of their experiences. And that's the way that it works in order to bring living history here, because that's what it really is. Today, we're going to be dealing with living history that is unmatchable. And as I said, it's for the first time because we as a DESA group primarily, not totally, but primarily are dealing with people who were from the enlisted ranks. Many of us were very, very, very young at that point. We all like to think that we did the best we could at a very, very early age, and we worked with some very fine people. And I'm talking now about the skippers of our ships, who were very, very old men at 26, 27, 28, while we were all 17 and 18. And fortunately, today we have a number of those people here, and we've never had the opportunity of having skippers assembled in one location where we might be able to have them speak to us and speak of their experiences from a perspective that we could not possibly have. We certainly knew our jobs, and if you happen to have a job in the bridge, you could have access to a certain amount of information or whatever it might be, but in terms of tactics or in terms of the much broader picture, it just was not available to us and really didn't become available until after the war, when we started going at this in our individual ways. Today we have some of those people with us. And before I even start, I'd like to just put things in perspective relative to the destroyer escort. And again, for the people who've attended any of my presentations, they'll hear me say this once again, that the DE was developed as part of the Lend-Lease program, where we were going to be building 1,000 destroyer escorts for Britain. And this was back in the early 1940s. We had held on to the privilege of holding on to the destroyer escorts if we needed them in the event we got into the war. But the purpose of the destroyer escort was really a takeoff on the corvette, on the 7 Coast Guard cutters, the Secretary Class 327-foot cutters, and was 1/3 the cost of a destroyer, and certainly as good in terms of anti-submarine warfare, in fact superior in many ways. And therefore we developed the destroyer escort as we know it, a single hull that could be used in a flexible way. Basically there were six classes. If you could just flash this over here. In the basic hull, this happens to be an Edsel class destroyer escort. The basic hull is there, 6 classes, all of them 306 feet except for one class which was approximately 10 feet shorter. And this happens to be the 306-foot class Edsel that you see. And the hull was there, and it turned out to be very, very adaptable. So that instead of just the United States holding on to, or rather turning over these vessels to Britain, we held on to a great number of them. We built a total during the war of 563. 2 of them were launched, actually making it 565 10 years later. I don't know if anyone knew that, but they were actually launched but then commissioned 10 years later. And then out of that number of 563, approximately 78 went to Britain, around 12 to France, 6 to Brazil. We kept the rest. And you can just, they ended up going into various classes. As I mentioned, that they were adaptable. And at the very top, you see the pattern of camouflage with regard to the Atlantic. So you've got the light gray and the dark blue. The middle is one of the adaptations of converting your hull into an APD, or an attack personnel transport, of a smaller variety with its enclosures for troops and for its landing craft. And DEs were turned into those, either converted or they were built specifically for that purpose. The camouflage that you see there on the one in the middle and in the bottom are for the Pacific. Next. And here are other variations. And the only thing I wanted to mention before I go on to the next stage would be the matter of propulsion, that we're dealing with partial steam, we're dealing with turboelectric. You had the propulsion systems, and we did have, on the basic destroyer escort, 12,000 horsepower, in other words, 2 6,000 power units. But then as the demand came for landing barges, for invasions, we then converted these to the point of using one of those engines instead of 2, and the only loss was going from 24 knots down to 21 knots maximum. Some of the classes had 3-inch open guns, others 3-inch guns, others had the 5-inch guns. The torpedo tubes that were not available on the shorter hull class were available on the others, but except for the Pacific, they really were never used. And for the most part, after the ships were going to go to the Pacific, they had gotten rid of those torpedo tubes and put on more aircraft, more anti-aircraft. Now, at this particular point, I'm going to proceed because I'd like to take advantage of our guests. And in this particular case, I have a great deal of pride in introducing someone. And if you could turn on the light back there, just off that button. Would you catch that? Just turn that. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, you can turn that on. At this particular point, I would like to just, by way of introduction, describe to you something that I'm involved in. You probably have heard through DESA News, or however means there might be, that we are in the process, I'm talking about DESA, we are in the process of having the strong possibility of acquiring a real destroyer escort. Out of the 565, we're down to approximately 26 at this point. Out of the 26, there are around 13 of those, or 14 of those, that are APDs. Many of them are in Asia, and they've been just chopped up, and they're in all different types of use. And there are very, very fewer destroyer escorts left. We were fortunate in making contact with Uruguay, and they had 2 of them that they were getting rid of. One of them was the Bronstein, and this was initially our first choice of vessel, but there was a foul-up somewhere along the line. It was in the hands of the scrappers, and it was scrapped before we could do anything about it. The other ship is the Baron, and making a number of telephone calls and a number of contacts with Washington through the use of a lot of people who were involved from both DESA and DECO, the Commanding Officers Association, DE Commanding Officers Association. We had gone down there, I'm talking about, in this particular case, another individual and myself, to meet with the Uruguayans and hopefully negotiate a transfer enabling us to get the Baron for us in the United States. And basically we would be getting it through DESA, but then hopefully turning it over to a non-profit institution to run in conjunction with us. It would be we would not be maintaining it, except in the form of having a good deal to say about the museum and its operation. And at this particular point, it appears as if this is going to take place. We are very, very encouraged by everything at this time. We just feel that hopefully either this winter or this spring, we're going to see a destroyer escort in this country. Now, at this point, I'd like to say, I mentioned a person was with me. And all I can say is that I felt it was one of the high points of my life to be able to spend 9 days on bus, taxi, airplane, canoe, just about any type of method of transportation that you can visualize with an individual that has had so much experience and has such a background that every time he was talking, I was flipping on my tape recorder. So whenever I see him, or in fact when I hear his name, I automatically turn on my tape recorder, because I have dealt with people with no one like the individual that I'm going to introduce to you. He was the former skipper of the Bronstein. His experiences with the Navy go way back. Every time something would turn up in Uruguay, we would be talking to people about the Graf Spee, which was sunk down there off Montevideo, and all of a sudden, this individual would say, well, I was aboard that. And then we would be talking about Churchill. Well, yes, I spoke to Churchill, or whatever it might be, or Golda Meir, or what. The point is that you'd never say anything, but yet these things turned out, just as a matter of fact, in a conversation. And as we dealt with tactics of destroyer escorts during World War II, and what they had done in the overall position of their role in the war, and with the war itself, and with the post-war Navy, and so on. It was an experience just being with this very unusual man. And at this time, I'd like to mention that his life did not end after the Navy. He became the head of several institutions, one of which was the Maritime Academy up in Fort Scholar, active with the UN. And at this particular point, and he's going to be helping me at this time introduce our other guests, I'd like to introduce Captain, but retired Admiral Sheldon Kinney. Sheldon?
Thank you, Martin. I just wish that my parents could have been here to hear that lead-in. Dad would have enjoyed it, and Mother would have believed it. Shipmates, it's good to be with you here. How many Edsel sailors? Monstein. Shipmate, again. Great to be back. Martin and I had quite a trip down there, and being aboard that destroyer escort was really a nostalgic visit to the past. It was just like you had been set back in those early 1940 period days and lived again the experiences of the DEs. One thing in particular struck home. As we went through the ship, very little had been changed, including the heads. As I thought back to Captain's inspection and looked at those troughs with the water rushing in at the upper end and past the pairs of wooden seats and out at the other end, I had always smiled at inspection because in the mid-Depression, I was a Blue Jacket high school dropout on a minority enlistment serving in Omaha and New York. And in the Omaha, when we load ammunition, they were 6-inch. And I was just barely able to get one of them up so I could sympathize with those that would suddenly go for the head at such occasions as the ammunition barges came alongside. But a very enterprising bosun mate had an antidote. He used to wad up a newspaper, light it with a match, and toss it in the upper end of the trough. Martin asked if, since I was involved in the Atlantic from pre-war until well after the war, I might mention a little bit about Atlantic background. I had made it to the Academy and graduated pre-war, and when U.S. was getting near, was assigned in one of the 4-pipe destroyers that was loaned to the British, in effect, to escort convoys in the North Atlantic, taking them from the Canadians, and I'm sure some of you did it, south of Argentia, Newfoundland, and carrying them over until the British picked them up on the way to the British Isles. During that period, of course, no radar, which probably, I hope, accounts for the fact that I took the bow off the Sturtevant as officer of the watch in a blind snow meeting off Cape Race one night. But we made it on to Londonderry, filled the bow of cement and made it back, and eventually got sunk in May 42 after the U.S. had committed the war. They were rather desperate days, as those of you that might have been involved remember. There were far too escorts. President Roosevelt had assigned our destroyers in good numbers to the so-called support force in the North Atlantic under Admiral Bristol to help the British, who were running short on escorts and were dangerously close to losing that important battle. Had that been lost, of course, we would not have been an arsenal democracy because there had been no capability to carry the materials of war so badly needed to Europe. It was a successful effort, but when the United States entered the war, the U-boats shifted their activity to the east coast of the United States, and many of you may remember that along the east coast, it was usually possible to see a tanker burning somewhere from Florida right on up to Maine. And there were so few escorts that they didn't even form convoys, which proved a terrible mistake and a lesson that had been learned in World War I and apparently forgotten in World War II. I know on our particular ship, when we came out of the North Atlantic at that time to try to cope with it, we seemed to spend more time picking up survivors than we did hunting submarines. My rescuer, having been banged up a little bit in the ship sinking, the skipper got on the telephone at the Bureau of Navigation, later the Bureau of Naval Personnel, and said, "Now, you fellows line up and tell me what you want, and I'll try to get it for you." Well, I was full of tales of John Bulkley and MacArthur, and we were expendable, and I got on the phone and I said, "PT boats." He thought I said PC boats. So I wound up in Miami at the Subchaser Training Center, concluding that the brief career of Ensign Kinney had concluded. There, some of these gentlemen who will speak to you in a minute were classmates. Al Chester and I were in the same group going through there in 1942, and have been good friends ever since. When we concluded, I got stuck as a gunnery officer instructor for a short time and finally managed to talk my way into being exec of the first DE commission on the Gulf Coast, the Edsel, which was up here a few minutes ago. And on the conclusion of shakedown, I found myself in command, and my commanding officer assigned as the first squadron commander of destroyer escorts. And you mentioned these old skippers of 26. At that time, I was 24 years old, and it never occurred to me I wasn't perfectly competent to do the job. However, I was set in a very proper frame of mind when, after assuming command, the Chief Master at Arms led the way forward from the fantail. And as we passed the line of double rank of Chief Petty Officers, who at that time were still pretty experienced people, a lot of them being recalled Fleet Reserve, a small voice from the rear rank said, "And a little child shall lead them." Within 3 weeks of shakedown, tragedy. The Reuben James, coming out of Key West, managed to hit the marker. She was a school ship for Miami. We got ordered down in Edsel to replace her as a school ship, and I'm back in Subchaser Training Center again. So I stormed Captain McDaniel's door, which was very unsuccessful. You'll recall he had a theory that never mind individuals, it's the war that counts, and Kinney, you'll stay here and command that school ship and make raids around Cuba with prospective commanding officers replacing one half of your deck force. And I did for 3 months, and then he relented and said, "All right, you can go out to the Pacific." He was aware that my brother had been lost in Arizona and that I had a particular grudge against the Japanese. And I was assigned to the Kind, commissioning, I believe, in Long Beach. Got as far as Chicago, having rounded up my wife, and in Chicago, a message, "Turn back. Kind is delayed. We can't afford commanding officers rattling around the United States. Go back to New York and commission the Ronstein." So back we went. Trunks went on to the West Coast. We went to New York. Ronstein was commissioned in December 43. And I think she's one of the stories, of course I know her personally, that really proves the magnificent capability of American men of that time to go quickly from civil life to war and achieve considerable success. Roughly 3 weeks after shakedown, we were involved in sinking 3 submarines in one night and captured the crew of a 4th submarine 2 weeks later. And yet in that particular ship, rather than the somewhat heavier experience in Edsel, I think we might have had a total of 22 in the crew that had ever been to sea before. And in the wardroom, 2 had been to sea, my executive officer who commanded a subchaser in Africa, and my gunnery officer who'd been in the Armed Guard. Everybody else, as you well know, had had their training and schooling. They might come aboard as second-class machinist mate or motor machinist mate, but they had all been in school. And yet that group fitted themselves together and performed what Chief of Naval Operations later described as the most concentrated and successful anti-submarine action by a U.S. ship against the U-boats. So I pay tribute today to a grand group, the Destroyer Escort Sailors. I went on in subsequent years to spend a lot of time in ASW, to have 11 commands at sea, to be in combat in Korea, and to command the interdiction forces in the Tonkin Gulf. But I still look back on the Destroyer Escort days when somebody says, well, 47 years in uniform, what comes to you as the most outstanding? And the answer is DEs. So that's why it's such a pleasure to be with you today. These other skippers ought to get their turn here. We have an organization called the Destroyer Escort Commanding Officers of World War II. Since everybody is a captain, it's very hard to consider that anybody can be a leader. Consequently, we have a permanent executive elected among us and a guiding committee. And I'd like to introduce at this time Jack Maloney, who is our leader.
Hi, Sheldon. I'm the leader, as Sheldon says, because my DE was the highest number in the fleet. Number 800, the Wilkie. Any Wilkies here today? Well, I started out, Sheldon, talking about the tough time on the east coast of the United States. On a 4-pipe destroyer, we were milling around out there, picking up people every other day, going into port and seeing the lights on in all the cities, looking out toward the sea and finding more submarines out there really than were actually there, but we thought there were an awful lot. There were, in fact, at any one time, no more than 7 U-boats operating off the East Coast. And they, by themselves, with a lot of help from us because we had no convoys, those 7 U-boats, some of them sometimes only 3 or 4, sometimes 6, they brought about what we can properly call the Pearl Harbor of the Atlantic. Finally, Admiral King relented and permitted us to go into convoy escort rather than going out there when a ship was reported sinking and trying to pick up survivors. And the thing worked just as the British had found out it worked very well for them. And our people finally believed them, and we got ourselves a satisfactory escort operation going, but not until the DEs themselves came along in 1943. I guess the Bronstein was one of the first, wasn't it, Sheldon, to get out there?
Edsel Bronstein was December 43.
Yeah. That's the point when things started to shape up. My ship, like most of you all, participated in no more than 1 U-boat encounter, but by the time the DEs came along, there were an awful lot of them out there in the Atlantic, and we had to parcel out the operation among us. I'm sure that Sheldon Kinney's record of having 3 U-boats sunk and 1 so badly damaged they had to scrap it when it got back to port is the largest number of any U-boats sunk by any ship. And unless some of you guys can come up with a bigger number, that's it. I'd like to introduce three more of our group. One of them, Captain Al Chester, has a marvelous record with both the Merchant Marine and the Navy. Commander Archer Trench is an amazing guy who, during the war, went down to Montevideo one time. Maybe he'll tell you a little bit about that. And Admiral Pat Coburn had an outstanding record in the Atlantic and Pacific. And I want to call on them each in turn. And first, we'll start off with Captain Al Chester, who will then introduce Commander Trench and Admiral Coburn. Al?
Well, gentlemen, you've met me. I've been here a few days, but you really, now you've met two very distinguished captains, and you'll meet two more. One of the things I have found out doing research lately is that there's something unusual about a destroyer escort. I spent many years of my life at sea, and after I swallowed the anchor, I was in the steamship business and worked with ships all of my life. But you see it every day at your convention, and we see it at the DECO conventions in another way, but you really see it here when you see the thousands of people that come out who have lived 60, 70, 80 years, maybe even more. And yet, the 3 years or less that they put in destroyer escorts is so embedded in their minds and their lives. It overshadows what they did. And I know a lot of these people, and I've gotten to know more. And these young enlisted men that we knew came back and had meaningful lives and did a lot of things. And yet you come back loyally. When I watch these thousands, I mean, it's a phenomenon. To be a captain is just being one of you. You realize it was an honor to have sailed on those ships. There was something about them. I was a professional sailor, but no other ships in my mind. The type of duty that we had and the things we experienced was ever an equal to what we experienced on those ships. I could mention I commanded two. I commanded the USS Edward C. Daly, the D-17. Is any Daly man here? And the D-208, the USS Cofer. Is anyone here from Cofer? Or one?
I'm pretty sure it's a Cofer here.
We're in contact with quite a few. Most of my Daly shipmates have disappeared somewhere, but the Cofer, they rounded up over 100 survivors. Many are dead in addition. And amongst our group, we're an average of 10 years older, and the attrition is accelerating. I served in the first DE in the Pacific, Central Pacific, 43, and second DE, I covered a lot of miles. I went Atlantic all the way to Bizerti, and then they converted us to an APD. I got the full course. And then we went to the Pacific to have a little fun with the kamikaze planes. We couldn't have had any more fun than we did. Some of us came back, they didn't. And it was an experience. In ending, I'd like to say that in the research I've been doing, contact I've been in with so many of the enlisted men, I'm getting quite a different story than I had in my mind. In command during a war, one is unable to get around as much as one would like, particularly in the DEs, as Admiral Kinney mentioned. We had so few experienced officers and petty officers that if you couldn't very well get away from the bridge area when you were in any possible place where you were subject to attack, your only chance to get around was in port, and we weren't in port that much. So I'm getting a new slant, and I understand more the camaraderie between your groups and what it all stands for. Last night, as I watched you all out there dancing, not all of you couldn't all get in there. It was a big band, and it was going back those many years. You were doing the old steps, and the only thing physically you looked a little older, but mentally you were all there, and I just wish that the spirit that you people have could have been extended a little longer. A country, you won a war for this country, you won the Battle of the Atlantic. We wouldn't have won if we hadn't won that. And no matter what the captains do, if they don't have good enlisted men, no way. And in ending, I'd just like to introduce, I guess, Archer Trent, because we'll save the Admiral for the end. We'll start with an Admiral, end with an Admiral. But Archer is a real seaman, and I think you can accept him, and three of us here never became admirals, but here's another loser. Come on up, Archer.
Well, I don't know what sort of sea stories are appropriate for this group. I started out as a Corvette sailor. Any Corvette sailors here? No Corvette sailors, pity. The next ship was a destroyer escort, the Christopher. 1 week after shakedown, Sheldon was fighting the Battle of the Atlantic. We were down fighting the Battle of the South Atlantic. Perhaps you've never heard of it, but Admiral Ingram was assigned the responsibility of the Fourth Fleet. He was called back after retirement, and he was stationed in the Recife. And at that time, the mission was to stop raiders going, German raiders and mystery ships going up and down the Atlantic with supplies. When we got there, that was pretty much over, and what he had was a nice base. He brought in his son, Bill Ingram, who was All-American, and for the Academy in 1938. He said, if Roosevelt can have his son for an aide, I can have my son for an aide, thereby ruining one guy's Navy career pretty much. Well, Admiral Ingram had a job of goodwill with Uruguay, and he was going to go down for a show, and I was detached from the convoy. Last ship down, first ship out, to go at high speed to Recife and get my orders. I was rushed up to Admiral Ingram's office, and I was told in great secrecy I was to proceed to Uruguay. Ingram would be down with a cruiser in his Air Force, but I was to go on down and not mention a word of it. And so I went back to the ship, and I called we were fueling, and I called the executive. I said, I'd like to speak to him. He said, I hear we're going to Uruguay. I said, where the hell did you hear that? He said, the guy loading the ship told me. Well, I think I'm the only DE skipper to have taken a ship to Uruguay. I like the privilege of bringing one back, but the list of applicants is long. Also, as you may know, the ship has to come back as a Uruguayan ship, because if it gets an American flag on it, it becomes a merchantman, and there isn't enough time to go through the red tape and the insurance and everything else. But I want to tell you a little about Uruguay. If you get a chance to go down there, Montevideo is one of the most beautiful places in the world for beautiful women. You've never seen such a beautiful place with so many attractive ladies. And the little incident I want to tell you about is that when we got there, Ingram had his planes there, and somebody came to me and said, could we borrow a pump? We have to transfer aviation gas from these big barrels into the planes and here and there, and could we borrow a pump? And I said, certainly. And we went off to sea, and I suddenly realized I'd lent him a handy billy. And a handy billy is cooled by the fluid that goes through with it. So here was my handy billy, transferring aviation gas. Well, we came back in, and all the flags were at half-mast. And my exec said, "Skipper, I think we've had it." Well, no, we docked, and there was the guys with the handy building. Said, "Thank you very much, it worked fine." Somebody ashore had died. Had nothing to do with it, just pure coincidence. On a more serious note, I went to our first ship's reunion to the Christopher several years ago, and I don't think any of us in the wardroom realized how much the crews enjoyed the ships. We knew we did. There were our yachts, there were things to play with. But I don't think we realized what a unique situation we had with reserve crews, reserve officers, a mutual understanding, and the affection of the crew towards each other and towards the ship was a revelation to me, and you see it at these meetings here. And I think this is a great occasion, and the first one in which the destroyer commanding officers and the DISA group have met together, and I hope it's the beginning of many reunions. I'd like to now introduce Pat Coburn, who has been in the Naval Reserve for 60 years, between ROTC at college. I think I'm right. 61. See, you don't realize how old we are. ROTC at college, Naval Reserve. We went to the local Defense Force School, which was the first step before SCTC. What it is a little refresher in Boston. We met together during I was on his ship for a while, made a mistake of sitting in his chair and was told you don't do that. And we were close friends, and he's a man who made Admiral in the Reserve, which is a distinguished accomplishment, Pat Coburn.
Greetings, friends. Are there any shipmates here from the Emory? We're having a reunion tonight. I just hope some of my old shipmates might be here. No. All right. There are other good ships. I only learned about 10 minutes ago that I was going to have the privilege of talking to you. So I didn't have a chance to write any notes. I'm picking up from what Archer said. It seems easiest to go back and talk a little bit how I got in the Navy as an ROTC way back when I got through